One of the common through lines that you'll get if you're watching my video is that I want your expectations as DM and your players' expectations to match as much as possible. Now, typically what I mean by that is there is a collective set of expectations, an overlap in the Venn diagram between what all of the players want and what the DM wants to be able to provide. That doesn't include anything that players are diametrically opposed to, right? If you have players that say, I've been dealing with stuff in real life that relates to race and color and all that sort of stuff. I'm not interested in that at all. And another player that is very, very focused on the idea of what it really means to be a half elf or a half orc. Those two players might not fit in the same table, and that's perfectly fine. Again, we're trying to get with what people are going to enjoy as a collective and make sure that we're not going to be getting anything that ruin everyone's fun, or at least ruin one person's fun to pull them away from the action. Today is going to be a little different. Today, what we're going to be talking about is much more individualistic. Rather than looking for deal breakers, we're going to be talking to what each individual player wants. Now, when I get into this, I do want to make one thing very clear. You do not want to over-reward or really reward in anything other than the intrinsic sense a player that wants to engage with the system a lot versus punishing a player or even just not rewarding a player that doesn't want to engage with the system. This should be optional, and people should not feel pressured to enjoy the game the way that you are telling them that they must enjoy the game by any sort of system that you build for it. So I'm not going to be talking about rewards for engaging with this system, and we are going to be talking about things on an individual level, because you can very much have a table where one person at the table does 10 of these things and one person at the table does none of these things, and those people can play at the same table and have absolutely no conflict. So what we're going to be talking about today is delegating your responsibilities or some of your responsibilities as a dungeon master to your players. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is. Now, one of the things that I hear from a lot of dungeon masters is that the players are not invested in the world, invested in the system, invested in the game. They're not paying attention. And it's not that the DMs are saying their players are bad players, but rather there's something with the way that the game table, the way that things are organized, the way that this game is run, that is just not connecting with them. It's not meshing with them. They're not getting into the flow of things. And any players that do want to engage with the system a little bit more, they don't have a place to start. And that's what we're going to do today. Now, one of the other big pieces here is that that thing that a lot of DMs are talking about ends up being a cause or an explanation for a lot of DM burnout. I'm just tired of carrying the weight of everything, of forcing everyone to pay attention, trying to draw my players in all the time, and it's just too much. Or I have to, all the weight of all the stuff that I have to do. I have hours of work that I feel like I must do, which, spoiler alert, you don't actually have to do this as a dungeon master, but a lot of dungeon masters feel like I have hours of work I need to do before I get to the table, and then the players just show up. Maybe they haven't thought about the game once in the 2 weeks between sessions, and now they're ready to sit down and play and expect everything to be ready for them. So one of these things that we're doing is sort of bridging that gap a little bit. And the other thing is that if you have players that really want to engage with this system, it can really help overcome that perceived barrier of crossing the DM screen to be behind it themselves one day. So we're going to start with delegation in combat, because if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, a really large chunk of the rules of any of the edition is going to be built around the idea that combat is going to happen, that combat in D&D is relatively complex. You don't have an entire combat typically resolved with a single roll like you do in something like, for example, Blades in the Dark, or in a lot of the Powered by Apocalypse systems, you can have an entire combat resolved with a single roll or a single set of rolls. Now, in D&D, you're going to be doing blow by blow, turn by turn, swinging the axe, having each individual thing cut up into these small pieces. And because it's cut up so finely, even if you're playing a relatively simple edition for combat as compared to a really complicated edition for combat, you still have quite a few things to manage as a dungeon master. So what I always do, and this is something that has worked very, very well for me in the past, is I delegate some of the roles to the players. For example, I have some of the things that are delegated to the players are delegated to the table as a whole, right? So some DMs will take initiative rolls for all of the monsters. They will take a piece of paper behind the DM screen and they will write down the initiative for each person in order. And when it is that person's turn, the DM will announce, all right, you are up next. And, after you, who's on deck is goblin number 4. So I know that's me. And then they kind of go like that. Now that creates a distance between the player and the DM, right? You can make this more of a table understood thing with the way that I do things, which is making initiative flags. I have numbers 1 through 20 that are on little index cards folded in half. And at the beginning of combat, when we roll for initiative, I pass them out around the table. So if a player is saying, all right, I want to go get a drink and I'm at initiative 4, and you look over and the player says, okay, there's the last person initiative is 15 and we're at initiative 6, I've got plenty of time to go grab my drink. Or if a player is looking and they have sort of a limited resource, right? They have a reaction that they want to use, but it refreshes in a lot of versions of D&D at the start of their turn, and they go, oh, do I really want to use this reaction? Wait, the person who's going is initiative 3, I'm initiative 5. Oh, I'm probably not going to get another chance to use this round. I'll go ahead and use it, right? The players aren't really gaining a lot of information there. They're things that they could have probably all figured out either by writing down who did what the first round of combat, but there's no reason to do that. Just show it to the players so that they can see what's going on. Now, for the delegation part of things, I go one step further and I tell one of the players, all right, you're in charge of keeping me honest on who's in what initiative. So when I pass everything out, I might have 4 flags in front of me and I probably won't keep track of, although usually I'm pretty good at keeping track of in my head, which flag goes with which monster that's on the board. I just tell one of my players, hey, let me know when this happens. Now, if you're using a VTT, a lot of VTTs will do this and a lot of the other things on this list for you. But a lot of what I'm going to be giving advice about here is at table stuff. And I think that while some of the tools in the VTT are nice, they also accomplish the same thing of making it clear what needs to happen as a DM. It makes it less mystifying for the player if they ever want to make that jump. The next thing that I do, which is a little bit more controversial than the initiative thing, is monster hit points. Now, I don't tell my players this monster has 50 hit points, that monster has 22, that monster has 18. I just say, go ahead and have one player, they keep track of how much damage a monster has taken, and then I tell them, hey, just rattle off what the total damage taken is every now and again. If you think that the person's getting close to being injured, let me know. And if you do use this system, I would highly recommend the system that you're playing in does not have bloodied, which means a little marker saying that this monster is half health or lower, that you can institute that just to make it easy for the player to be able to better know when to ask how injured a creature is. If they say, all right, this guy has taken 15 points of damage, and you say, he doesn't really look like he's all that injured yet, the player can say, all right, well, if he takes 20, I probably don't need to ask again, but if he takes 25, I'll ask. Or if the player says he's taken 25 points of damage and you say, okay, he's bloodied, then the player can look down and go, okay, he was at 18, he is now at 25, he got bloodied, he got reduced to half health between those 2 points. I think he's got a hit point somewhere in this range, and so they better know when to ask the DM, hey, is this guy dead yet? He's taken, 40 points of damage, and the DM go, he's hanging on by a thread. Now, for some people, they think that this kind of breaks the illusion, right? They're seeing too much of how the sausage is made. But again, this is something that the players would be able to figure out on their own if they felt like it. And by showing the players that this is something that is just a thing in the world, it makes things a little bit more believable to the state of this is a game that we're playing, the numbers that you're rolling, the damages that are being dealt, the attacks and stuff that is happening. It's having a objective effect on the overall encounter, and I'm not just saying this monster has a narrative amount of hit points, and when I think it's okay for it to die, it dies, so what you do doesn't really matter, which I personally dislike as a DMing style. I also am not a fan of the advice that's actually in the 5th edition Dungeons Master's Guide, and is in the 4th edition Dungeons Master's Guide as well, that advocates for fudging rolls and then not letting your players know, because if they know that you fudge the rolls, that it's going to ruin something for them. I would just rather not set up a situation to ruin ruin things for my players, and I can do that very easily by just not lying to my players about what's happening, right? And by putting a lot of these things in the players' hands, not only does it make it to where I can be much more on their team of, oh yeah, I really want to make sure you get here, and we are kind of as a group working to that 50 hit points to get that monster down. But the other side of that is that when stuff does inevitably go horribly wrong, I think it makes it more fun for me as the dungeon master to see how this is going to resolve. Even if it's a total party kill, or a player dies, or something happens, or a player character dies and something happens, then we can really kind of go into that. And if I keep the kid gloves on, if I fudge it to make it more narratively interesting and satisfying, and I want to make sure that the heroes survive and overcome by the skin of their teeth, and I'm going to massage things to make that happen, I just don't think that that's as fun for me as the dungeon master. And by putting a lot of these things, including the monster hit points and monster initiative, on the player side of things, it kind of adds to that feel that this is what's happening, right? The monster does have 50 hit points. I was the one that kept track of the hit points, and I know I did that 50 to them. And by that same token, you want to put things, if you're playing a game that has a lot of complex conditions. Again, most editions of D&D have something like this, having a player in charge of conditions that are on the players, or conditions on the monsters. If you're playing a game that's relatively complicated, like 4th edition and sometimes 5th edition at higher level, you would want to divide those into 2 different roles, and just having it have one player whose job is to go, all right, well, you have advantage on that next attack roll on that monster, is nice to have that, because it's keeping the players involved. The more that the players are reminding the other players of things that are going on, the more that the players are the ones that are the start of what's happening and can answer their own questions, the less of the pressures on you as DM to kind of make all of the machinery of D&D function, and you can focus more on how things are interacting, right? Consider a goblin being hit with a ray of frost. They have their movement speed reduced for a certain time. It'll be reduced until a certain point in initiative, and they've taken some damage, and they might have to change their turn. Well, if you can, instead of thinking about all 3 pieces, I need to write down this monster's change in health, I need to write down when this monster's speed changes back to normal from the Ray of Frost, and I need to think of how the monster is going to change its turn based on its lower hit point total and its lower movement speed. If these 2 pieces can be managed by your player, so you only need that one piece for yourself, that is so much easier for you to be able to quickly respond and to keep the flow of combat going, to keep things moving forward. And the last one we're going to talk about a little bit is what I generally call the note taker. In D&D, even in 5th edition and older editions to a smaller degree, combat can last a certain amount of time. That it might last 20 minutes, it might last half an hour. And if this is a big climactic set piece moment, maybe it lasts for 2 or 3 hours. And some of the things that happen in there might get lost in the churning through the machinations of the game. And if you have these sort of story reveals or things that are going on or things that need to get written down in the middle, having someone who's a note taker in combat, even if that's not your note taker outside of combat, can be very handy for when we get to the end of the combat. The note taker might go, hey, that guy, in round 3 made this crazy prayer in another language. Can we think about what that means? Can we write that down for later? Because that might have gotten lost in sort of the attacks and damage and all that sort of stuff that gets pushed into D&D. If you want to keep that going, and having a player remind the other players about it, again, takes a little bit of the weight off of you. Now, I've talked a ton about combat, and before we get to the end of this video, I want to talk about some other non-combat stuff as well, because those are equally important. So you can help give creative control of pieces of the world to the players. And one of the stereotypical, I would say, examples, or one of the examples I've seen the most often of this, is giving the player control over their hometown, right? The player says, I'm from this place at the base of the mountains. It's an old elven fortress. And you can say to the player, okay, That's cool. I have an idea of something that could work like that in my world, and you as the DM can build that up if you want, but you can also ask the player, okay, well, what sort of stuff was there? Would you like to be involved in building this thing? You can tell the player, I have an idea for these couple of things, maybe these couple of quest hooks that can be from there. What sort of stuff would you build in there, right? And you can want to ask fairly specific questions, and you want to encourage your player to rely upon tropes, because tropes can make things so much easier for building and really work well as sort of training wheels to get things going, especially for a new DM, a player that wants to be involved in what's building up. So if the player says, no, I'm not really interested in that, I'm not like a writer or anything like that, you can say, well, you can give it a try, or you can give me some examples of maybe towns from movies or books or shows. If they're really not interested in it, don't worry about it. If they are interested in it, they can give you some examples, they can give you some tropes, or you can ask specific questions like, what is specific about the mayor? Does your character really like them or really dislike them? Do they have a strong opinion one way or the other, and then why? What was the town beforehand? Is the town built on the ruins of an older town? What was that older town? You can say, can you think about anyone in your family, anyone that you're connected to? And rather than saying, oh, my older brother is Fred, or my older brother is, Bob, or, Melchizar, or whatever you want to do, you can just say, cool, well, player, you can give me a name if you want, but what's important for me as the DM is knowing kind of the attitude, the opinion of that guy. So knowing your older brother is, my honor matters more than anyone else. That's a key thing. If they're playing as Galad from the Wheel of Time as their older brother, that gives me as the DM a lot of pieces of information that I can work with, and they can build stuff from it. If you have the person who is in charge of the town is an enchanter who uses their own charisma in mixing with their magics to charm people, and people kind of know that they're being charmed, but also things work out, so it's sort of an open secret. People don't like it, but people like the consistency that it provides. Then that's very useful, right? You can have them go to TV tropes and look things up and be able to build something that's interesting. And when it is time for that player to maybe go behind the screen and try to run stuff on their own, they've already done a lot of the work to get there, right? They've already seen how initiative works at table. They've already know how the monster hit points work and how to keep track of player conditions and how to manage everything that happens in combat. The only thing they haven't seen at this point is how to run the monsters, and how you run the monsters is pretty similar to how you run a player character. So they'll have a lot of the pieces that they already need, and that transition will be a little bit easier. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about today is going to be goals with clear rewards. Now, this is something that I'm saying can very much be on the DM side of things. And Matt Colville has a video about player reward cards, and I will link that video down below. This is kind of basically that same concept, only the point here is that you really want, like our discussion with the relationships with NPCs, you really want your PCs to bring at least one of the two halves of the equation to the table, right? You want to say, all right, the PC says, I want to find a artifact item, right? I want to find this legendary cool thing. And you can say, cool, all right, your goal is you want to find this legendary cool thing. If you do this, you'll find this legendary cool thing. And then you can write that first half. What do they need to do to find that legendary cool thing? Maybe you can just say, this legendary cool thing is said to be at the bottom of the Dragon Barrows. And the players can see on the map, oh, the Dragon Barrows are over here. Now, the players have something to be invested in, and the player might go, well, I don't know anything about the Dragon Barrows. Well, do you want to give some information about the Dragon Barrows? I'm going to provide the information for what that artifact is and what it does, but what are the Dragon Barrows could be something that the DM and the player can work together with, or what the item is could be something the DM and player can work together with. Or the players might say, hey, I really think it's cool to go to a place that is an ancient crypt. I don't really have any ideas of what to do there, but I've always thought it would be fun as a player to go into an ancient crypt that was dedicated to something. And you can say, great, your thing you're going to do is go into an ancient crypt. That's the first part of the card that you as the player have provided. And as the DM, I'm going to say, Well, at the bottom of that ancient crypt, there is a creature, an ancient undead that has been slumbering through all of eternity, that if you wake them up, you can give them context for the world as it stands, and they will be able to work with you, though they remain bound at the bottom of the crypt. They might work with you as a source of information for truly ancient knowledge that would be otherwise lost for a cost. You might have to bring them sacrifices. You might have to bring them pieces of information about the world as it is now, and they will give you in return, in exchange, information for the world today. Or rather, you give them information today and they will reward you with the way things were in the past, so you can put pieces together, right? You're creating a lore engine and a way to reward the player all as one piece. And again, if the players either create the goal or they create how they want to go about getting to something cool, then they'll feel more invested in doing the other half of it because they've already done one piece of the puzzle. So that's all we're going to talk about today. I know it's a pretty big subject with a lot of different pieces, but the core element here is expectations on exactly what the different PCs are going to be doing in the adventure, and making it something where the PCs don't have to engage individually in something if they don't want to, but if they do engage with it individually, and if they do kind of pull themselves further along this line, they're going to find themselves with all of the tools they need to run their own game pretty soon, and then you as a dungeon master, you might have a new dungeon master to play with. Anyways, see you next time.